I'm now in conversation with Ricardo Sainz, who's based in Spain, and I'm going to have a conversation with him about some of the issues and challenges to do with the use of virtual reality for clinical healthcare, particularly for a range of different mental health issues. But to begin with, I'm going to ask Ricardo about his career, how he got involved in medicine and psychiatry in the first place. So where did it all start for you, Ricardo?
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you. It probably all started with my grandfather. He was a doctor. My father was in the Navy, and that's pretty much everything that I knew when I was growing up. So when I was given the choice of being a doctor or going into the Navy, I thought that if I did medicine first, I could always be a doctor in the Navy. So it seemed to me that that was the sort of the less restrictive of the two options. When I did medicine, I did it out of a sense of social contract. We felt very lucky to have been born in a family that was able to put me in a position to have a higher education. And I did medicine in Barcelona. I really liked the brain and neuroscience in general, but I realized that I didn't speak any English. And if I wanted to provide my patients with the care that they deserved, I had to be able to keep up with the latest research. And the latest research is always published in English. So in 1998, I packed my bags and I landed in Burnley, near Manchester. And I worked at the Burnley General Hospital in a place called Lamont Clinic as an SHO, a senior house officer in psychiatry, and the supervision of Dr. Mike Lona. Now, Mike Lona was a visionary. He was a psychiatrist that first acknowledged the beneficial effects of clozapine in patients despite the terrible side effects that the drug may cause. And he set up a clozapine clinic in Burnley. The other clozapine clinic in the country was located in the Institute of Psychiatry and was under the direction of the late Professor Rob Kerwin. So I worked with Mike for about 3 years, and I was completely taken by the immense possibilities in terms of research, but also of care delivery for people with psychiatric disorders. And that's where all started. And I, it hasn't stopped since. So I've been looking after people with mental illnesses one way or the other for the past 22 years.
Wow. So you started in Burnley, but I gather you also spent some time in London. Just tell me about that.
That's right. So in Burnley, I got in touch with Professor Kerwin at the Institute of Psychiatry. He was doing a research a study that was funded by a French genetic research company called Genset, and they were looking at recruiting people with treatment-resistant schizophrenia to map up the genome, trying to find out risk alleles for psychosis. I started recruiting the clinical sample in Burnley and the north of England, and the company then offered me a job in Paris. And again, I didn't speak French, but I thought that I didn't know enough about genetic research, so I moved to Paris from 2000 to 2002, and I worked in the medical affairs department there. We published a paper in PNAS. We discovered the G72 gene and the G30 gene, because at the time Genset had access to the sort of most comprehensive mapping of the human genome. And after the publication of that paper, I had insisted on taking metabolic parameters from the participants on the study. And the company was bought by Serono, a pharmaceutical company that used the information that we had to open up research lines in obesity and diabetes. And at that point, I went back to London, 2002, to the Institute of Psychiatry to work under the supervision of Professor Rob Kerwin. And it was there where I finished my training, my clinical training in psychiatry and my consultant in general adult psychiatry. And I also did a master's in research methods in psychiatry and a PhD in neuroscience, looking at biomarkers in the peripheral plasma of people with schizophrenia. So I lived in London until 2018. what I did after my PhD is I took up a consultant post in a medium secure hospital that at the time was part of a independent sector provider. And the hospital was called the North London Clinic. And we started a rehabilitation program for forensic patients that saw 74 patients discharged from medium secure conditions to the community in 4 years. And we received the first outstanding rating by the Care Quality Commission for a rehabilitation program for mental health in mental health services. So it was at that point in 2016 that I thought that after all the work that I've done, my impact was being limited to these 12 or 15 people that I was discharging every year, and I wanted to have a larger impact. So I applied for a job in a pharmaceutical company, a Japanese pharmaceutical company, as a European medical manager for neurology and psychiatry. And in there, I worked for 3 years between 2016 and 2019. I was part of the team that launched brexpiprazole, an oral antipsychotic in Europe, but I was also looking after the neurology portfolio. So we were focusing on Alzheimer's disease at the time. And my move into digital health comes about at the end of 2019. I am contacted by Psious. Psious is a Spanish startup that specializes on the treatment of affective disorders using virtual reality environments. It has a library that you can think of pretty much like a Netflix, where you can choose the environments that you as a therapist would like to apply as part of your therapeutic interventions with your patients. And most of the environments that we use are based on exposure therapy, although some of them can be used in evocative therapy. So they were looking for a chief medical officer, and I started working with Psious in October last year. And my work in Psious has been to create the roadmap in terms of clinical development, but also training, research, and regulatory processes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting observation, because the use of virtual reality for mental disorders is extremely new. But I wasn't aware that you'd had some experience in genomics. And I would be interested on your views on the impact of genomics on mental health. What part do genomics play in people's propensity to have mental health conditions, or is it primarily environmental and situational? Where are the majority of mental health conditions? What's the basis of them? Do genomics and genetics play a big part in mental disorders?
Yeah, I'd say that it does. There are disorders like, for instance, autism, autistic spectrum disorders, but also bipolar illness and schizophrenia that have shown an important effect of the genetic component. But it's also true to acknowledge that despite the effect that this genetic predisposition may confer to the subject, the effect of environmental influences is there. In a very similar way, I would simplify it's a very simplistic example, but if you had the genes to predispose to suffering from lung cancer, for instance, if you don't smoke, then those genes are never triggered and you don't get the disease. It would be very unlikely. You will be very unlucky to get lung cancer if you don't smoke, right? And in a very similar way, you may have the genes that predispose you to suffer from a mental disorder, but if the environment is nurturing, if the environment is protective, you might delay the onset of symptoms, or you might not even suffer from those symptoms. So I think the short answer is yes. There is a big, there is a large genetic component, but it varies within the type of mental disorder that you're suffering.
Thank you. You explained that extremely well. My understanding is already. I love these interviews because I always learn something new during the interview. So going on to Psious, what are the origins of the company? Did they start out from the very beginning thinking that they would create virtual environments that would help to address some cognitive and mental health issues?
Yeah, I think I've asked this question to Xavier Palomé. He is the CEO of Psious and is one of the co-founders. Back in 2014, Xavier Palomé and another friend were trying to help one of his friends who had fear of flying. And Xavier and the other co-founder had the technical knowledge that allowed them to make a virtual plane and expose their friend to the sort of anxiogenic environment of flying in an attempt to help him overcome this fear of flying. And it really took over from there. They realized that it was a very interesting tool. Xavier dropped out from his studies and started the company. Our chief product officer, Xavier Oromi, is the developer that has written the code for all the environments that we have. And at the moment, we have over 70 environments to treat a variety of disorders. The way the environments have been developed has been evidence-based. Psious doesn't have their own randomized controlled trials, but what they did between the team, the developers team, and our chief scientific officer, Jean-Michel Gelabert. Jean-Michel Gelabert is a clinical psychologist, and he was very up to date with the research coming from the use of virtual reality to treat mental disorders. And if you can think of a three-step process, 20, 30 years ago, virtual reality was a IT tool that showed promise in rendering the reality into a computer-generated graphic. And that's done, and that's proven. We could do that with computers. Then there was another large group of research and studies that showed that people with a fear of flying experience the same physiological responses when they are confronted with the real plane or the virtual plane. And this is because the seat of your irrational fear, of your phobia, is in sort of an almond-shaped structure in your brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is where the emotions and the reactions, the fear, flight or fight response is located, has not evolved to differentiate virtual from real environments. It's just, it's just reality for them. So the amygdala is tricked by going into a very immersive virtual reality environment into thinking that you are actually living that situation, and your body responds with an increased cardiac frequency, an increased skin conductance, respiratory frequency, etc. So those studies were also done, and patients responded the same. And then there was another third wave of studies in which researchers everywhere thought, okay, we have the tools that can recreate anxiogenic environments. We have shown that anxiogenic environments create anxiety in this type of patients. Now, can we use those environments to deliver exposure therapy to people? And exposure therapy is based on the principle that if you are exposed to the anxiogenic stimuli in a gradually increasing process, eventually you will create the anxiogenic response will be extinguished. So there were groups that were using their own virtual reality tools with standardized cognitive behavioral therapy protocols to treat patients with this type of disorders. And it worked. A lot of people said during those studies that patients were more readily prepared to accept virtual reality treatment than real treatment. And that's because Your prefrontal cortex is telling you this is just a game, it's a video game, right? It's not a real plane or it's not a real spider. So the time that it takes from you to seek help reduces because you're more willing to engage with the therapy. Then once you are in therapy, the cognitive loading that was required to either imagine the situation or compensate for the anxiogenic effect of being in a real situation decreases, and you can concentrate on receiving therapy. So people realized that not only patients were more readily available to take virtual reality treatment, but also they needed less sessions, and the sessions tended to be shorter. So John Michelgelabert read those papers and thought, okay, so here's the description of the plane, and the plane has to have 3 seats per row and 2 rows and a corridor in the middle, and this is how we're going to do it. And he told the team, the developer team in Psious, and they recreated those scenarios. So everything that you see in Psious is evidence-based, but we haven't done our own clinical trials to demonstrate the effectiveness of those tools as treatments, because we consider them tools. We don't consider them treatments per se. We put an emphasis in saying that these solutions that we create had to be delivered to patients always under supervision. So we don't sell this to patients directly. We allow therapists to purchase a license, pretty much like a Netflix model, to have access to the different tools. And then once they have the tools in front of them, the computer, they can connect with the patient remotely and launch the environments that they think is going to fit the best with the therapy that they are delivering.
Okay, so there is a telemedicine element to this, in the fact that the patients can be in their own home or in another environment with a headset, but what they're exposed to can be under the control of a remote psychiatrist who's able to load the environment and control it for them. Oh,
Exactly.
that's very interesting. Yes, this whole business of CE marks and FDA approval for lots of devices, it really is a minefield.
It is.
And it's not helped us, as you've indicated previously, by the fact that there are new headsets coming on the market every day, and you can have an infinity of different virtual environments. And how can you test each one effectively? But no, I realise that the evidence for the efficacy of this kind of treatment is already taking shape. In fact, some years ago, when I was director of the Serious Games Institute at Coventry University, one of the projects I came across was an early example of the use of virtual reality environments to treat burns patients. You may have heard of the Snow World project, yes. Where patients having their burns dressings changed were exposed to a game in which they had to knock over penguins with snowballs, listening to Simon and Garfunkel. And so it wasn't so much as a gentle exposure to the kind of thing that would cause distress. It was more to do with distraction therapy, taking people's mind off what was actually happening to them in real life. I think it's very interesting. The other thing that you mentioned is that the pharma companies are now, because they have this risk aversion and they are so used to having clinical trials and CE marks, it's interesting that they are adopting a strategy to appoint someone like you with your background and your expertise to help companies to bring their products to market. So in Europe, how do you see the situation? Is it likely that Psious will be getting CE mark for any of their products, or will the model that you use of providing this to physiotherapists around the world, will that kind of take a back seat to developing the commercial model?
It's a difficult question to answer very quickly, but I'm going to try. Most digital health companies, by and large, are funded and inspired by pioneers. right? And you have to think of these guys very similar to the sort of frontier cowboys that went on horses' backs into new territories, discovering the unknown. We need these guys. We need these guys to show us where to go and how to get there. But we also need the people that came behind them, planting the telegraph road, as it were, making sure that those roads they opened by sheer willpower and determination stayed open. And I think the regulatory processes is that wagon that comes behind them, right? So in Europe, we had a medical devices directive that was planned to have taken place in May last year, but because of the COVID pandemic was delayed until May 2021, next year. This new medical device directive considers software as a service as a medical device. And in Europe, there are 3 classes of medical device: class 1, class 2, that's divided into A and B, and class 3. I'm not going to enter into the different aspects of the classification, but class 1 is very simple, innocuous medical devices, and class 3 are the more complex. So for instance, a Band-Aid would be a class 1, right? And a pacemaker would be a class 3. And everything in between a Band-Aid and a pacemaker fits in between 2A and 2B. According to the new regulation, software as a service will be classified as class 2A or higher. Class 1 only required for the old law, for the old sort of directive, to provide the regulator with something called the Declaration of Conformity. And the Declaration of Conformity was a document that you as a company prepared stating that you have conformed with the different ISO standards in the production of your solution and the quality control of your solution, and you have systems in place if things went wrong, right? And that was good enough, and that's a class 1 medical device. With class 2 medical devices, things get a little bit more complicated. And one of the complex things for digital health to provide is clinical evidence. Clinical evidence, you have to think that regulatory processes are in place mainly for the safety of patients. And the safety of patients, according to the pharmaceutical model, is only proven through a very stringent process of clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. In phase 2 trials are the ones in which dose is found and the safety of administering the treatment to healthy volunteers is proven. And this is the stage in which most COVID-19 vaccines are now. And then in a stage 3, phase 3 trials, you vaccinate or you use a large sample of population with the disorder, and you use a randomization system to compare your solution with a control group. And that way you could show whether your solution is better than the standard of care or a placebo. So in pharmaceutical industry, this is very lengthy and it's very expensive, but they have one advantage, which is the pharmaceutical compound remains immutable from synthesis to the end of the commercialization license, which is granted in exclusivity to the manufacturer for a period of years. So you can do your discovery, you can do your pre-human studies, you can do your human studies, and then you can go to market knowing that no one else can copy your ibuprofen formula until you reach the end of the license, right?
Yeah.
In digital health solutions, if we do an environment today with Unity 2.0, when Unity decides to upgrade the software and goes to 3.0, we will have to upgrade that environment. If we use a headset from Pico or from Oculus, that, imagine that we use the Oculus Go. The Oculus Go is now withdrawn from the market and it's Oculus Quest, and there's already a Quest 2. So by the time we go through the phases of the regulatory process and we want to go to market, then we will find that the equipment that we have used to conduct our trials is obsolete. So you're going to need another study to compare the obsolete technology with the new technology and ensure that the same effect is recorded. So what is the solution for this? And the solution for this is phase 4 studies. It's what they in pharmaceutical companies call post-marketing surveillance studies. And it's once the solution is out there, which is the case for most of the digital health companies, they do an app and they put them up on the Apple Store, on Google Play. Once the solution is there, you have to have a system of recording serious untoward incidents, of recording side effects, but also recording efficacy, effectiveness, and satisfaction from both clinicians and patients. And if you're able to prove that through the use of patient-reported outcome measures, that your solution is safe in terms of not causing serious untoward incident or major side effects, and is well accepted and has effectiveness and efficacy in the real market as real world evidence, then you can compile the dossier that you need to go through the regulatory process. It's not rocket science, but it's a lengthy, complex, and costly process.
Yeah, I think you've articulated that very well. Well, I could talk to you all day about many different things to do with mental health and devices, not least the use of these headsets that monitor your brainwaves, like Muse or NeuroSky was one that I was familiar with at the Serious Games Institute, but we don't have time for that. Now, what you've given me in this interview, Ricardo, is very, very useful, and I will look forward to publishing it on YouTube and also on the International Society for Digital Medicine website, and look forward to involving you as a panelist in one of my upcoming webinars, expert panel discussions. So thank you very much for your time and joining me today. Thank you.